Alfred Hitchcock's film Rear Window, released in 1954, is surely one of his best and certainly a masterpiece. It is not just a film you can learn from, it's a film you can live in, a kind of whole space-time that only art can offer. This particular study argues that film's success as an enduring place for the imagination owes to its articulation of space folding known as projective geometry. It won't be necessary to have expertise in this, I hope. Rather, I've tried to let the film explain how, in projective geometry, 2D surfaces achieve self-intersection and non-orientation, and how these two qualities were originally conceived as the uncanny in ethnological forms of ritual and folk practices. These have always been the basis for stories, as forms we don't notice, but because they work as structures, they keep being passed down. In the secularizing process, we see the everyday transformed into something clever, compact, and instructive. They don't tell us what to think, but rather how to realize our situations as human subjects in the world with other human subjects. In this particular lesson, architecture plays a key role. It is Rear Window's carefully designed set that allows projective geometry to do its thing, to fold and unfold, and to break out of its Euclidean mold. I've divided this study exercise into 3 parts that can hopefully build a bridge between popular culture and projective geometry that most of us can cross. There are actually 4 things, but the 4th thing is a bit complex, and it ties together the trio. And since it's about architecture's ability to insulate interior space from exterior space, it's foundational for the way we understand how architecture constitutes a special kind of space and time that does not fit the standard Euclidean model. Anamorphosis is normally about the way images can hide other images inside them, which can be seen only by looking at the image at a special angle or with curved mirrors. But there is a deeper sense of anamorphosis that has to do with the invisibility that is automatically generated with every experience of visibility, both as a remainder and as a secondary world that is simultaneously intimate and inaccessible. Projective geometry is the name for the branch of mathematics that was discovered in 300 AD, but not developed until the 19th century. Today, it is hardly understood, and some architecture theorists have actually vilified it. But it is key to understanding the functions and interactions of 2 kinds of virtuality. The first belonging to perspectival experience, the second belonging to imagination and dreams. The third term, the 4th wall, comes from film criticism, where it is used to talk about how the audience sitting in a dark auditorium turns up in the intimate interiors of lives on stage or screen. This is presence that is absence, and presence because of absence, so it fits in nicely with the theme of anamorphosis. But here we're going to learn that the 4th wall has a structure that is remarkably consistent with projective geometry. Anamorphosis is probably the first place to start this conversation, since it's about how, in ordinary experience, we can see the critical role played by the uncanny. The standard example given for anamorphosis is the famous painting by Hans Holbein made in 1533 when he was in London. 2 young wealthy guys, ambassadors of the French court, wanted to be painted along with their expensive toys, which included musical instruments, books, and an impressive collection of navigation instruments. Possibly to protect his clients from the evil eye, Holbein painted a blurred image at their feet, running at an angle, which can be seen correctly only if you kneel below the bottom left corner. What most critics have missed, however, is that on the back of the painting, Holbein painted an over-precise time for the painting's completion. April 11th, 1533, 4 p.m. Why so precise? The scholar John North has shown that the angles of the skull image intersect with the horizon and vertical line connecting the viewing point to the crucifix to fix 4 p.m. as the time Holbein and his astrologer friends thought would be the end of the world. April 11th was Good Friday, the end of 3 eons lasting 500 years. Adding the 33 years of Christ's life to the day of crucifixion, and the number 3 present in angles and dates, you have a program of numerical overdetermination. Because the painting has to be turned over to get this fuller view of Holbein's intentions, the painting's edge works as a hinge to a door that opens to connect the perspectival world shown on the front to a different kind of virtuality that includes the back. The painting's 2 sides are actually facing in rather than out, and the hinge is really a way of turning the painting inside out. This is the recommendation I would make to convert the historical instances of anamorphosis into a general principle that can be used to apply to every case of looking, every case of the imaginary, where psychoanalysis shows that we require 2 kinds of virtuality. So, in Rear Window, even the title tells us that we have an inside frame that is a cut inside the work that turns it inside out. We would do best at this point to refer to what is called in mathematics projective geometry. Since I want to refer to how this geometry structures an entirely different kind of perceptual experience, I use the expression projective virtuality, a second kind of virtuality to complement the virtuality of ordinary experience. Projective geometry begins with taking our visual experience of perspective seriously. We see parallel lines converge on a point lying at infinity, on the horizon that has the shape of a circle around the visible world. Yet Euclid tells us that this point cannot possibly exist, that the parallel lines can never actually meet. This is his 5th postulate, one he could never fully prove, and which has been controversial for the whole history of mathematics. In 300 AD, Pappus of Alexandria decided to accept the perceptual reality of converging lines, horizons at infinity, and the vanishing point, to see if there was a geometry that could speak directly to our human perceptual experience by making the vanishing point an actuality rather than an abstraction. So for every straight line on the Earth's spherical surface, there is a vanishing point, a real point, and any line parallel to it also vanishes at the same point. The horizon is not a straight line, but a circle that is the limit of visibility. Beyond it, there is nothing. The horizon is a real limit. So it has to create an interior that is both visible and invisible. As the horizon circles around us, we see that for every vanishing point, there is a double lying opposite, behind our direction of view. To correct for this circular limit with paired vanishing points for every family of parallel lines, we make a circle. The horizon line, the set of all possible vanishing points, so to speak, is a circle beyond which there is nothing, and thanks to its fictional status, inside it can be everything. This is the principle known in Latin as ex falso sequitur quodlibet. Whereas the true can be followed only by the true, if we begin with a fiction, both the true and the false can follow. Logicians have called this the explosion of the false. We can draw a circle with 2 points, but we have to remember that this is a circle that doesn't cut off an inside space from an outside space. It's more of a circuit, a completion, a flow of energy. Forget for a moment that it is like a map you look at from above, and think of a line of travel instead. It's really a picture of the saying, ex falso sequitur quodlibet. There are 2 vanishing points, but the 2 points are actually the same point. Both are generated by perceptual convergence, but the lines don't point in one direction or another. We can portray 2 points, however, to imagine how space might spin around them to preserve their union, and how the horizon is the link. They are 2 points in the sense that, if we spun something around them, the spin would be transferred as it travels from one side to the opposite. This crisscross is critical in understanding the horizon in a way different from its geographical function. The mirror actually reverses front and back, not left and right as we normally say. The mirror cuts down the middle of our viewing space, but the topology of projective space doesn't do this. So the spin is not in reference to an outside or inside of the hemisphere, but to the 2D surface, which is equivalent to a disk. Think of moving the point around the rim, twisting it 180 degrees as it reaches the opposite side. When we look at a film entitled Rear Window, we can expect to meet up with some topological ideas. It's a cut that opens up a space between 2 surfaces, Jeff's own apartment surface and the surface of the apartments opposite him. Topologically, his position can be compared to a point with a chirality or spin that is opposite the spin of the point placed on the mystery of the apartment opposite him, occupied by Lars Thorwald, and at least for a while, his wife Anna. Topologically, we would say that Jeff and Lars are non-oriented. Their spin is opposite. Jeff sees the parallels between Lars and himself, but he believes that fundamentally he is good and fundamentally Lars is bad. In projective geometry, we say it's virtual because we can't do what it requires us to do in Euclidean geometry. The instruction in this case is to fold the edge of one side of the hemisphere's lip over to the other while twisting it. The twist command requires us to imagine that all of space will have to be twisted to carry this out. We can't easily picture this, but we can use narrative elements. We say that Lars has seen Jeff watch him, realizing the direct connection. Then, he locates Jeff's apartment by calling him, and using this address information, he travels around the block to enter Jeff's building. This is a variation on the extreme case of 2 people who live next to each other physically, but in different buildings. They have to leave their buildings and go around the block to visit. I've already introduced the expression in Latin based on the logical principle that if you start with a true proposition, you can only have true statements that follow it. But if you start with a negative, then you can follow it with anything. This is called an explosion because basically anything can result from this ex falso position. In the film, we actually see this explosion following Thorwald's going around the block to reach what is as close as his glance. We can't read Latin, but we can understand how an explosion might be the flashbulb blindness that keeps Lars from rushing forward. The meeting of the 2 vanishing points, Lars and Jeff, results in Lars pushing Jeff out of the window through the inside frame. He technically vanishes in topological terms, but in movie terms, he just gains a new broken leg, and the mystery is solved. Ex falso, the crime, leads to everything, the true and false clues, but ultimately the space is folded into its true projective shape. Rear Window's main theme, hardly ever discussed, is about insulation. The residents of the courtyard at 125 West 10th Street don't have enough of it, so they have to open their windows and curtains. They still feel a degree of privacy, however, because they do things in full view that they would ordinarily conceal, which means that insulation is present as an imaginary function, one that Stella accuses Jeff of violating. The technical term for insulation is idempotency, the power of keeping something the same, insulating it from disturbances or differences. And it's key to the way that the brain handles stimulation, whether positive or negative, to balance things out, using dopamine to return neural circuits to a low-energy, steady state. To get across the idea of idempotency, I use the example of shapes that magically are able to keep the square they occupy unchanged, even though they flip positions. In the process, they define an interesting leftover, which you can also think of as a lack. There are two 90-degree angles. One fits into the center tilted axis, while the other fits into the retaining square frame. In one position, the shapes fill the frame. In the other position, there is a leftover space. In the closed position, there is nothing left over, but if we reverse the location of the inner right angles so that they are on the outside, an amazing thing happens. This is a two-dimensional example of turning something inside out, so we can connect idempotency, of maintaining a fully filled square frame, to the problem of what Jacques Lacan called extimity, the topological identity between inside and outside, or the fact that an intimate exterior is the other side of an alien interior. When we feel at home in some travel location, that's the intimate exterior. When we are spooked by the desire of the other, or afraid in our own houses, that's the alien interior, just so you know. The small remainder is simultaneously a surplus and a lack. In the film, we know exactly how this is represented. It is the ring without a finger that is Anna Thorwald's wedding ring, that Lars kept after he disposed of his dead and dismembered wife. This materializes the horror of the murder with the thought that he separated this ring by cutting off Anna's finger. The counterpart to this position inside the square, as the hidden object and key to the crime, is the little space, the ring outside the square. This is the girl without the ring, which is Lisa's situation of wanting to marry Jeff. The story proves idempotency and also extimity, and just as curious, it shows how the two are related. Most students of architecture have already encountered this little space on the inside that is the same as the space on the outside, in the golden rectangle, where no matter how many squares or one-to-one shapes we add, the ratio of the rectangle's sides is always the same, meaning that the shape is idempotent, not just in spite of change, but because of it. The negative, or ex falso part, is the reason for this ratio, and it leads, as the Latin motto says, to an explosion of the shape, which is the golden rectangle specified as a spiral. As the rectangle tries to surround itself, it equates the interior with the exterior, which is what we see in the spiral that is generated as the square shapes are added. Another insulating feature of the golden rectangle is the fact that the ratio never changes, no matter how many squares we add or subtract. But this ratio can only be approximated by making an interior cut between the Fibonacci numbers that, as you may know, create the next number by adding the previous number. Each fraction that results from sliding the series across itself is a progressively better approximation of phi, the numerical value of the ratio. This inside-out or extimate situation returns us to the theme of anamorphosis, the function of the edge as a hinge between two identical aspects of the same reality. In the Holbein painting, it is the small angle that allows us to see the skull in correct perspective. In the idempotent shapes that maintain the one-to-one frame, it is the rotation that puts the two right angles of each shape first in the center, then on the outside, transferring the gap that is represented by the wedding ring in the movie from an inside position, inside Thorwald's apartment, to the outside condition of being recovered by Lisa. From the ring without the woman to the woman without the ring, we have an identity between Anna and Lisa, an Anna-Lisa. This shifty shape correlates with the way Holbein used 27-degree angles to relate the view of the skull, where the viewer was in a position directly beneath the crucifix, half hidden at the upper left corner, to the horizon running through the sound hole of the lute. This overlay of secret lines relates to the overly exact date on the other side, 4 p.m. on a Good Friday, 1533, and its involvement with the number 3 to put us at the hinge position between a scene where we were simultaneously present and absent, in the position of Golgotha, but separated from it by 3 eons of 500 years and 3 times 11 years. Again, a 1 and 1 situation. At Paramount Studios in Hollywood, Hitchcock constructed a 6-story set with a basement capable of handling the rainstorm runoff generated on the first night of the story. The apartments were finished beyond the needs of what needed to be seen in the film. They had electrical wiring and plumbing. There was a light system to flash cues to the actor residents. The fully furnished set was made to look as realistic as possible, and indeed the courtyard has the look and feel of a New York City space, even in the 60s and 70s, when working-class people could still afford to live in Manhattan. Jeff's studio is suited for a bachelor with frequent out-of-town assignments, but the spaces we see reflected in Jeff's telephoto lens had to be set up so that we would be able to imagine them focused on the far wall of the apartments. Like the mirror in the back of Velázquez's painting Las Meninas, where the two figures reflected are much too large to be those of the king and queen standing in the doorway, an intermediate had to be set up. Lisa wasn't made out of thin air, but based on a famous model who was actually a model and also a business executive for Harper's Bazaar. She was a 1950s icon of the successful woman, featured on the covers of Life and Time magazine. Grace Kelly had a similar reputation in Hollywood for being in control of the films she starred in, as well as the way she was directed. John Michael Hayes wrote the screenplay from a story by Cornell Woolrich published in 1942, It Had to Be Murder. With the addition of cinematic space-time, Hitchcock added an important dimension to the story, which was the twin relationship binding Jeff to Lars Thorwald and Anna Thorwald to the sympathetic Lisa. With marriage as the overriding theme, as it is in many of Hitchcock's other films, it is not insignificant that a wedding ring plays a role both as a key to the story, but also cinematically, as the visual object that collapses the distance separating Jeff from Lars. If you look in a mirror, it's tempting to say that you see a reflection and let it go at that. What happens, however, is more mysterious. The smooth, reflective surface makes a cut in space, down a new middle. The cut doesn't create the chirality of space, that is, the way space is structured stereognostically as a matter of left and right. Rather, it allows us to see what has always been there, but only as a virtual reality of space. The rear window, which looks to an inside rather than an outside, is chosen for this very reason. It reveals and makes specific what is already there but virtual. This makes the rear window and the mirror anamorphic devices. What they show is, like Schrödinger's cat, is both alive and dead at the same time. The problem with doing this kind of analysis is that it doesn't seem to show up on the drawings we customarily make to describe spatial arrangements. In the plan, we see how Jeff's studio apartment has a corner position at the end of the building on his street, with a projecting bay window bringing in more light, like the ones shown here from Bilbao, Spain. Jeff's slight projection into the courtyard gives him a more spherical or panoramic relationship to his neighbors' apartments, and his hinge position assigns him the role of someone who collects folk tales. In part, the film is an anthology of stories about the people who live around the courtyard, the struggling composer who is being visited here by Hitchcock, who winds the clock, the childless couple who lower their dog in a basket to let him run around the courtyard, a single middle-aged woman who seems to have no luck with men, a dancer who practices her routines and seems to have too much luck with men, a sculptress working on a bust that summarizes the psychoanalytical theory of the human subject as having a hole through them, the Iceman who visits regularly enough to make us think that Hitchcock is parodying Eugene O'Neill's 1939 play, The Iceman Cometh, and the newlyweds. Thorwald stands out because, of all the neighbors, Jeff thinks that Anna, who is ill and resentful of Lars, is now what Lisa could end up being. Jeff thinks this is generically true of marriage, and not that he is anything like Lars, or that Lisa is anything like Anna. It's a part of his bachelor's early warning system. He wants to confirm his status as an adventurer, with some good years still ahead, and the idea of a settled life scares him. Given that we have a movie about the architecture of a courtyard and a physical model of the literary form of the anthology with a built-in storyteller, we have to think about how language theory might become a way of looking at architecture. From the semiotics theorists of the 1960s, we get the division between the forward-running order of language, where we have to wait until the end of a statement to either confirm or revise the meaning of the first of the statement. The end always has this revisionary power over the origin. In architecture, diachronic order is about the way buildings are used and how use completes or fills out the design, sometimes in ways that revise the original intention. We are familiar with the repurposing of factories into chic restaurants. If the renovation is lucky, then the factory looks like it had wanted to be a restaurant all along. Synchronic order is about replacement of individual words, or in architecture, about filling spaces with alternative uses, occupants, or materials. It can be the variety of shops filling the retail spaces along a street, or in an apartment building, it's the constant departure and arrival of tenants occupying fixed spaces. The replacement process seems almost to belong more to architecture than language. The words can change, but the grammar remains the same. So, when Jeff looks at the collection of apartments across the courtyard, the Thorwalds stand out. In the same way, replacing an expected word in a sentence with an unexpected one creates a new and powerful charge to the otherwise smooth flow of apartment life. This grammatical shift happens because Jeff thinks what the Thorwalds are doing, fighting mostly, has to do with him. Lars' wife Anna is sick and complaining. Lars seems to be calling another woman on the phone. The more the Thorwalds bicker, the more Jeff congratulates himself for remaining single. Beyond the differences, Jeff sees a guy who packs up his valuables in a suitcase and travels a lot, just as Jeff puts his camera equipment in a bag and takes off to faraway lands. Lisa is not sick like Anna, but that could be a matter of time, Jeff thinks. What if it's her in a wheelchair and not me? The equation of Jeff loves Lisa somehow becomes Anna hates Lars. Agents and actions reverse together. When the Thorwalds argue, and then Anna seems to leave suddenly, Jeff uses this minimal difference to justify singling out the Thorwald apartment for closer inspection. To do this, he breaks the rules of perspective that hold everything else in place, grammatically, at a distance across the courtyard. His synchronic curiosity plays with the possibility that his neighbor might be a murderer. Let's look at this more closely. Synchrony uses a metaphoric logic of replacement. Metaphor is not just any suitable alternative word, such as chum for friend, but a word that brings with it a completely different and potentially dangerous new context. If Lars is a murderer instead of a neighbor, then not only must Jeff try to do something about it, the whole space of the courtyard changes. Neighbors are seen in perspective, which corresponds to the map view of courtyard space. Closer neighbors are bigger, more important. The ones further away, less so. Distance is an index of relationship and interest. All of a sudden, when Thorwald acts suspiciously, the perspectival order of space must change in response. When Jeff begins to use his binoculars, then his telephoto lens, he does what the fourth wall in cinema does. And so, the analogy of Jeff watching Thorwald to us watching Jeff takes on a new validity. We use a fourth wall to insert ourselves into Jeff's private space, but now we see that Jeff now needs a fourth wall to insert himself into the Thorwald's private space. His geometric transformation procedure is something we can see and apply retroactively to what we have already done in watching the film. We have Hitchcock's clear analogy connecting Jeff's windows to the cinema screen to justify our comparison. When we see Jeff straighten out the converging lines of perspective, we realize we are doing the same thing. When we see the point at infinity brought within reach and reconstructed as the gaze that fascinates Jeff, a gaze located somewhere in Lars' apartment, we are discovering how the gaze works in cinema and how its location is an important issue. The parallel between what Jeff does that we can follow and how this duplicates what we have done, but done unconsciously, means that this film is, apart from its entertainment value or moral lessons, a story about our generic experiences of cinema, an experience that takes place across or through an imaginary, semi-permeable fourth wall. Note that in the story there are two vanishing points. The one that is Jeff belongs also to us, as fixed in our seats as he is stuck in his wheelchair. Lisa breaks into the apartment to find the other vanishing point, which Hitchcock has materialized as the wedding ring, an object that is both lost and a proof of Anna's dismemberment. It is Lars' broken promise, but simultaneously Jeff's promise to Lisa. So Lisa hides the ring by putting it on her finger. Like the purloined letter of Edgar Allan Poe's story, the best place to hide something is where it's most likely to be. The two vanishing points don't represent objects, but rather the desire those objects seem to collect and store, like an electrical charge. Notice the function of negation. The ring is hidden, can't be found. Jeff is stuck in a wheelchair, unable to act on his own. Negation endows these vanishing points with potential. They have no bodies, or at least not working bodies, but they have minds of their own. Jeff is the only one at first who thinks Lars is a murderer. The ring, however, has a different kind of mind. It gets other people to think about it. When the ring becomes a signifier within the parallel visible channels that Jeff has constructed, Lars uses this visibility like a car would use a freeway at 2 a.m. Perspective would slow things down, but the parallel striations of projective space mean that you are there before you know it. Lars suddenly knows how he got caught and by whom. All he needs to do at this point is make a phone call to determine Jeff's physical address. The parallel lines that converted the courtyard's perspectival space into projective space are the same ones that allow the space to fold in a twisty way that gets the two antagonists together. After all, they are really two embodiments of the same idea, the bachelor, one before the fact of marriage, one after. I wanted to mix the issues of the narrative situation, which everyone in the audience can understand, with projective geometry, which almost no one understands, with the function of the fourth wall, which some film critics seem to understand, but only at a superficial level. If the fourth wall is more than an analogy of how the audience is present inside the fictional lives of people on a stage or screen, then it must have some rules, some structure, some operating principles. The origami folding of space in projective geometry accounts for the necessity of the idea of a fourth wall, but it goes further by showing exactly how space transforms itself to allow for this virtual presence. We can check out these rules by looking at the work of art, and in Rear Window in particular, we find that the story itself amounts to a kind of textbook about how projective geometry works in real life. So what do you think made Jeff think of using his flash gun to delay Thorwald's attack? Hitchcock here seems to understand how the connection of two antagonists is like the fold-over of a space with a twist, and how that is related to a sudden explosion of something. And the flashbulb idea must have popped into his head if it wasn't already a part of Cornell Woolrich's story. It is up to the critics to connect this event explosion to something deeper than mere catastrophe. The explosion is not chaos, but as we see in the scenes that follow, the chance to reorder the Rear Window cosmos so that the problems that were previously intractable are now able to find resolution. The explosive dissipation of energy allows the system to return to normal, which is to say its original low-energy state. The Iceman is back. The sculptor falls asleep with her cat. The childless couple have a new dog. Miss Torso's husband comes back from the army, and Miss Lonely Hearts falls for the music man. Jeff at least now has some symmetry, hopefully without the itch to get back to the jungle on a dangerous photo assignment. Even Lisa seems to have realized the advantage of accommodating to Jeff's fantasies by having one book to read when he is awake, another preferred journal for when he's asleep. The newlyweds to the left of Jeff's window have become what the others had been before the explosion. All through the film, they were the reverse case, as if Hitchcock needed to insert an even-odd profile to check against the odd-even of the general condition. The print of Rear Window circulating in the 1960s cut out the concluding nice touch, where Hitchcock lowers the curtains to echo the way he had opened them at the start, telling us that the window was like the theater screen. With the restored print of the 90s, this fine detail was added back, and we are given a good way to summarize the principle of criticism by punctuation, that the end of a story must respond to the beginning. In the course of this particularly vivid treatise about architectural space, we have had to revise our understanding of closure by incorporating ideas from projective geometry and the idea of the fourth wall. The point of these views, these rear windows, is that we look through them to see out, but are in fact at the same time looking in.